Hello and welcome to another episode of the ATACS podcast. We are adults, we talk about cool stuff, and today we are here to talk about a video game called Star Wars Jedi: Survivor. I am your host. Yep, got the colon right. I'm your host today. I am Flex from Raleigh, North Carolina. It is July 17th, 2023, and I am joined by two fellow Jedi here today. I'm joined by Nate from Clayton, North Carolina. How's it going, Nate?
It's going great. I was really hoping you were going to nail that colon.
Mm-hmm. No, I'm on it. I am a professional, as you may say. And also joining us is Mr. Ryan from New York. How's it going, Ryan?
It's good. It's good. I'm looking forward to talking about, I don't know if scrappy is the right word. Like, Fallen Order felt kind of scrappy and unexpected. I don't know if that's how I would describe Jedi Survivor, but felt the same in some ways.
Yeah, we're going to dig into it for sure. And yeah, this is... we joke about the colon because it's weird, but it also signifies that the franchise is Star Wars Jedi. So this is the Jedi. Yes. This is the Jedi series of Star Wars video games, and this is the second one. The first game was Star Wars Jedi: Fallen Order, which came out in 2019, and this is the sequel, Jedi Survivor. And the one warning up front is this is a spoiler cast. There will be spoilers for Jedi Survivor, and there's no way around it. We're also going to have to be a spoiler zone for the first game, Jedi Fallen Order, as well. So this is your one warning up front. Anything about either of these games, Jedi Fallen Order or Jedi Survivor, could be spoiled. So if you do not want spoilers, this is your warning to leave now, and then come back after you play the games.
I guess probably just like random other Star Wars spoilers in here too. I have no idea what your Star Wars experience may be.
We're not going out of our way to spoil any other Star Wars material, but that's a good point that I don't know what's considered common knowledge in Star Wars at this point.
Yeah, Star Wars is big. Did you know that one guy is that other guy's dad?
What? Just can't just throw spoilers out here like that. Come on, man. But yes, Fallen Order came out in 2019, and 4 years later, Jedi Survivor is out, both by Respawn Entertainment, is I think their official name.
Sounds right.
And yes, Respawn Entertainment under Electronic Arts, and the Jedi Fallen Order was actually kind of noteworthy because it was a little bit. It felt like a little bit of a scrappy game. It was kind of EA greenlighting a single player only game, which they had been out of single player games for a while at that point, and really, Fallen Order did very well, way better than they expected, and kind of prompted a pivot from EA to say, oh, maybe we should do more single player games. And as my understanding is, that also meant Jedi Survivor got a bigger budget and a little more time. I know the pandemic disrupted some of that because there was a pandemic that happened between these two games.
Although I guess from playing Jedi Survivor, there were times where it did not feel like that. Like, for me, it felt very much like an extension of the first game in some positive ways, but also in some kind of not so positive ways. And I guess I guess like we talked about a little bit, Fallen Order, when it came out, it was a bit of a surprise, and I don't know if we did a spoiler cast for it, but we talked about it. Like, it was a little bit of a surprise, a little bit of sort of a Star Wars, almost like an extended universe feeling game, in terms of like it did some interesting things with the Star Wars franchise, branched out a bit story wise, a bit janky on the gameplay side, like sort of a AAA game core, but I remember some like jank in the platforming from my recollection of playing it back in 2019 and playing Jedi Survivor. It felt like they took a lot from the first game, and unfortunately, they didn't really make the technical issues any better. They somehow surprisingly seemed to make them kind of worse, which I felt a little bit less. There was a little bit. It was a little bit for me while I was playing Jedi Survivor. I was a little bit less forgiving of it because Fallen Order was unique in my mind, and it did some things, and it's like, wow, this kind of came out of nowhere. It feels kind of scrappy, and like, even for a relatively big budget game, like it's like they're trying new things and building something new. Whereas Jedi Survivor is very much a direct sequel, and I had hard locks, and I had game crashes, and I lost progress, and I couldn't get experience, and I saw enemies fall through through the floors, and like it was, and there was a lot of platforming jank, like not grabbing ledges and stuff like that. I was pretty surprised at like how rough this game was technically for a fairly direct sequel.
Yeah, so maybe, and maybe we'll, since it's already come up a couple of times, that'll be our first topic, is kind of the technical performance and that kind of stuff, because both of these games did suffer technical issues out of the gate. That was Fallen Order was kind of well known for that as well. So I guess part of the what I'm curious about is like the conditions everyone played both games under. So like I played Fallen Order basically when it launched, and I played it on PC. And I remember feeling like I definitely had some bugs, but I also remember feeling like I maybe lucked out a little bit and had a little bit better experience than what I was seeing people on average were having, which I think at that point, maybe the PC was actually the better version for that game, because it was near the end of the PS4 and Xbox One life cycle. So I think that was at a point where like, PC was like kind of relatively stronger. And then Jedi Survivor is maybe kind of in the opposite boat, where it's coming out for PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X and S, and not for the previous consoles. And they clearly prioritize, it seems pretty clear to me that they prioritize the consoles. And from what I've heard, the consoles have had less issues. And I did play this on PlayStation 5, Jedi Survivor. And I also played it at launch. So I played both games basically at launch. I heard Fallen Order got cleaned up a lot over time. And like if you play it now, it's a fairly clean game, is my understanding. I don't know how long it took them to get there. But yeah, I'd be curious for both of you, like what your conditions for, and I did hit some bugs. It sounds like I didn't hit quite as many as you did, Ryan. I did hit some. I had my progress halted once in Jedi Survivor, where I fell through some geometry, and just got like stuck under the floor basically, and couldn't move. Fortunately, just dying and reloading a checkpoint fixed it, but it sent me back about 10 minutes, I think, because that's just when the last checkpoint was. So that was frustrating. Otherwise, I didn't have too many bad glitches. I just had like kind of your standard, just like clipping or weird physicsy things that don't actually halt progress. They're just like, they look goofy or whatever. I feel like I also maybe lucked out with this one, along with Fallen Order. Is in both games I definitely hit some technical issues, and I know a lot of people are hitting technical issues. Like I know they're there, but I do feel like I probably lucked out a little bit. And I guess the last thing I'll say is I do think, from stuff I've heard in interviews I've read, that the making this game in 4 years that spanned the worst part of the COVID pandemic really did hinder them on their development. So I do have a feeling that, we could argue that maybe they should have delayed it to to account for that or do other things, but it does seem like in the state that this came out was probably largely affected a fair amount by the pandemic. Not that that's an excuse; it's more of just a kind of some painting the landscape there a little bit. So yeah, I guess we'll start with you, Nate. Like, what was your conditions playing both Fallen Order and Survivor, and what in terms of technically, like how did you fare?
I actually think mine was very similar to yours, so I won't belabor the point too much. I played Fallen Order on PC. I don't remember if it was right at launch or not. It wasn't too long after, if not. And that game was mostly fine, if a little rough around the edges, but I didn't have any major issues. And then, yeah, same with Survivor for me. I played it on PS5 at launch. It was, a decent amount of like animation bugs or like voiceover bugs where like one person's line would start like 2 seconds too late and would roll into the next person's line, so they'd be talking over each other. That happened quite a few times, and it was always hilarious.
That sounds like a feature, not a bug.
Yeah. It's like that and basic animation stuff, but I never had any like crashing or lost progress for anything like that. Just goofy stuff. But yeah, I think games are kind of in a weird spot in terms of their scale and scope. I feel like they're not the super high-end AAA games that we get now, like the God of Wars and stuff, that are just like everything ramped up to the max. They're just going to take as long as they want to make it, and then dump buckets of money into it as long as they want. These definitely feel like, I guess scrappy is the right word. You guys have used that word a few times. I'm like, I guess as scrappy as something from EA can be, but it does.
That small upstart video game company, Electronic Arts.
Yeah, it does feel like in order to get these games green-lighted, somebody had to stand up in a boardroom and be like, "We will make this game in 4 years, and it will not cost an arm and a leg, and that's just how it's going to be because we're Respawn and we know how to make games." And that's what they did.
Yeah, there's a whole other conversation we could have about the development process. It is interesting that we can sit here and say, 4 years for a big AAA game from Electronic Arts feels kind of scrappy, but I feel like it's really mainly just Sony, yet it feels like Sony looms over everything when you think of like God of War or The Last of Us or Horizon, or Sony seems to be the one company that can just pump endless money and take 6 years to make a game and make it look amazing, and then it kind of makes people like EA look scrappy by comparison.
Right. It's weird.
Yeah, it is weird, but that's not something we should dig too far into. Ryan, so you already mentioned you had quite a few bugs, Ryan. So what platforms and stuff did you play on, and I guess what other issues do you want to highlight? Like, what was your experience like that you haven't already mentioned?
Yeah. So I think with the first game, Fallen Order, I played on probably PS4 Pro. And that one, again, when I say scrappy, like, I seem to remember, not catching ledges, some weird things with the platforming. Like you said, maybe occasionally, like a cut scene or animation would have a little bit of pop in or some jankiness, but nothing. Maybe one crash. Like, I don't remember. I remember it feeling a little rough around the edges, but nothing too affecting. And it's like, okay, this is not as polished as some of the other like high-end AAA games, but it's kind of new. And then with Jedi Survivor, I think I mentioned, I think the game just froze. Like, after I fast traveled, the game just locked up. I had the game crash, basically blue screen at least once, maybe twice. I think it was twice, but one was right before a checkpoint and cost me 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, that's rough.
It was starting to get and this is a $70 game. This is a new world of they're charging kind of top dollar. So I don't want to belabor the point. Like I do want us to get into the more interesting, but for me it was noteworthy. Like for this type of game, and because it's sort of a direct sequel, I know they probably they probably like moved to UE5 or whatever. Like they probably made some engine changes, but I was still that colored my opinion of things a bit. It was enough of a technical issues, and it's like this game shouldn't feel scrappy anymore. Not at this price, not at this not at this level of experience or whatever. But anyway, I digress. Maybe we can get into some gameplay and mechanical stuff that.
Yeah, we'll move on to some other topics. What if you said it, I missed it. What platform did you play Survivor on?
Oh, I might have forgot PS5.
Okay. So yeah, we were all on the same platform. So yeah, that is a bummer that you seem to have more issues than we did. It does seem very hit or miss, where like different, I don't know, just pure randomness. It seems like different people have run into different bugs. But yeah, we'll move on to some other topics, and the technical performance is definitely a notable issue with the game. Even me and Nate, who said we had less stuff, like I still had one time of losing 10-ish minutes of progress or so. So like there's definitely issues in the game for sure. Maybe our next topic will just be a little like coming from Fallen Order, like what did Survivor change and update? Like what how did we like, because Fallen Order, I guess to kind of like set the context a little bit, yeah, like Fallen Order was, you guys can tell me if you disagree with this, I feel like Fallen Order was like a fairly standardish like third person action adventure game that like kind of borrowed a lot from other types of games. Like it had like I don't know if this is derogatory to say, like Uncharted style like climbing and platforming, and then had like a little bit of like Sekiro or Souls type like I mean, most notably it had the method of respawning enemies by hitting a checkpoint, which is a meditation point, which is very weird to think about in the context of the Star Wars universe. Like they can
it's very strange.
It's very strange, but you go meditate and all of a sudden those stormtroopers are back. But and then also, and more Sekiro with like the parrying and stuff, and kind of a stamina system for blocking. So yeah, it kind of has, and then you have collectibles and you kind of navigate a 3D space similar to plenty of other games. So yeah, it's kind of taking those similar or those familiar pieces and assembling them. And Survivor is in a similar mold. I think it has probably one of the biggest upfront changes is it has a couple areas that are a little bigger or wider. I don't know if I would say like fully open, but like some wider areas, specifically or primarily Kobo. Is that the planet? Yeah. There's one planet that's pretty big. You end up bouncing between a lot of planets, just like in Fallen Order, but Survivor has one or two planets that are more open and have more space to roam around. So that to me feels like the biggest change. Maybe I'd say the stances are another big-ish change, but what else stands out to you two as like major or changes or updates worth commenting on? And if you want to comment on the things I mentioned as well, feel free.
Yeah, I definitely think the more open areas, larger areas, more side quests, more collectibles, making it more in that style of game where you have a big area and you can tackle lots of different things at your own pace and how you want to do them. That's probably the biggest like structural change from Fallen Order, which was a little more linear. It had side stuff and it had collectibles, but it definitely felt more linear playing through that game. And then I think it is just like the way that they left most of the abilities that you gained through Fallen Order intact, or gave them back to you pretty quickly in Survivor, and then just kept adding additive more on top of that, more stances, more force powers, all that stuff is just like, yeah, they kind of just did a lot of what the previous game did, but made it bigger and gave a lot more options, I guess.
Yeah, I think echoing that last point, that was the one thing I wanted to mention as well, kind of highlighting what Nate was saying. When I first started playing Jedi Survivor, it pretty quickly gives you the wall run, the double jump, some of the powers that you had, and I was like, oh man, I need to kind of relearn how to do double jump wall run, because it just kind of throws you back into it. And it's been 4 years since, but I like that. I thought that was a kind of a positive thing, at least thematically, where they're they're kind of continuing what Cal kind of learned all these powers and Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor. Now he's more of it's not like a Metroidvania where he gets hit in the head and forgets all his Jedi training, and you gotta relearn the double jump in your first 5 hours or whatever.
Yeah. No, I like that. I like that. When you get the Darth Maul double-sided saber in Fallen Order, it's kind of like a cool thing. You have this whole other fighting style that you can kind of lean into, and then at the beginning of this game, you just whip it out in a tutorial, right near the beginning, and then you can kind of start picking which stances you like, and then you get extra stances, which I'm sure we'll get into.
Yeah. I might be a weirdo. I feel like it was simultaneously cool to start off with all those abilities, and then I also feel like a lot of the new abilities weren't as interesting to me.
Yeah, that might be true.
Now I have the ability to grab onto this bird's legs and let it fly me, but that's I don't know. I just don't get excited about that.
Yeah.
So I do like that you start out with the new abilities and didn't have to relearn to double jump, because that just feels kind of lame. But I also do maybe the real complaint is I wish the new abilities you got were just cooler on average, because I feel like a lot of them were not that exciting to me. And maybe that's just a whole different complaint, actually.
I think that's fair. I did notice the same thing, and maybe when we talk about exploration and platforming in general, it'll, because with the new powers, I liked the grappling hook, I liked the kind of air dash, I liked the lift and slam abilities, but yeah, the wall jump stuff and the bird gliding and some taming, some of that stuff, it's cool they're trying to add new abilities, but some of it was just not very interesting, or it led to some very slow platforming sections, or off the top of my head I don't remember specifics, but yeah, I do remember sometimes they were trying to mix in a bunch of different powers, and sometimes it worked pretty well. It was okay, grappling hook, double jump, force dash, wall run, occasionally that worked out pretty well, but then there were other times where I was just man, this is a little bit tedious, or a little bit uninteresting, or it's not that much more interesting than just stuff you were doing in the in the previous game.
Yeah, I do think that a lot of the jumping mobility stuff could be cool, and they used it well, the grappling hook you mentioned, or the the dash, those kind of things I think could be used in cool some cool set piecey platforming moments. I think we'll talk about pacing later, but I think there were a few moments in the game where I felt like you go a long time without getting anything new interesting. But that's maybe more of a pacing issue than anything. Before we move on to that, though, I do want to hear what both of your opinions are on the more open nature we talked about. Like, did you like it being more open and having more side quests and more collectibles and more hashtag content, so to speak, like just cramming, like just adding a lot more stuff to do in the game? Like, did you like that, or would you almost prefer the more linear nature of Fallen Order, or somewhere in between? Or I don't know, where did you guys land on that?
I mean, I'm fine with it in theory. I'm not gonna say I disliked it, and certainly if other people enjoy that in this game, then I wouldn't. I don't feel strongly enough about it that I would want to take that away from other people if that's what they enjoy about the game. But for me, and this actually does tie into pacing a little bit for me, like when I'm given like a map like these games give you, and I know there are collectibles and side quests to do, I'm gonna start poking around and seeing like, oh, okay, are the rewards worth it? Like, what kinds of things do I want to do? And I think it's like, so Fallen Order had the problem of, I think almost all or all of the collectibles were just like cosmetics, ponchos, right? And this game has some of that same problem where most of the collectibles are like cosmetics and clothes and hairstyles and mustaches.
You need a new beard, right?
They have more cosmetics because now you get beards.
Yeah, it's a lot more. But it's not 100% of the collectibles. Some of them are actually gameplay useful. And so I would find some gameplay useful stuff and be like, okay, this is better. I like this. I'm finding skill points or health upgrades or whatever. I'm going to keep looking for more stuff. But then like the pacing of that and like the balance of like finding stuff that was useful versus not was off for me. And then that would eventually derail me enough from the main story stuff going on that I was having trouble gelling with the game for the first half when I was trying to do more of that side stuff as I was going. It was just like I couldn't get into the rhythm with it on either end. Like the exploration didn't feel quite right to me because I didn't feel like I was getting very much for the investment I was putting into that. That was also making me enjoy the story and the momentum of the game less because I was constantly getting distracted by things. So I think overall I'm a little bit negative on that, but if I was just better at not wasting my time doing things that didn't matter, then it wouldn't be a big deal.
Well, I mean,
Jedi Survivor here to teach you your time management skills, mate.
and I think you raised some fair points because in all aspects of this game's gameplay, exploration, platforming, and combat, I have mixed feelings. And when I was trying to suss out why, what I think it is, or at least in my mind, or I have a theory at least, is that Jedi Survivor rather, not necessarily Fallen Order. Fallen Order, I think, maybe was slightly more streamlined. Still kind of janky, but Jedi Survivor has strengths in terms of gameplay, but it often doesn't play to them. Like, it actually often actively countermands them, is the way I felt. And so, like, in terms of exploration, I found the maps kind of difficult to navigate. I was constantly leaning on the mini-map to figure out what I could do, like what I could climb on, what I could access. Slippery slopes, man. Those are the worst.
Yeah.
Until you can ride a chicken thing and run up them.
Yeah, except some hills you can walk on just fine, and then others that look exactly the same. Like Cal will do this like 5-second animation where he like turns around, and anyway, but
I know.
there's a lot of gating in terms of the powers. So like I would unlock a new power, I'd be like, oh, I remember something. I'd go back to that, and then there would be another gate, like another power gate for a different power immediately after it. And it was like, man, I hate this. It's like a total waste of time until you unlock all the powers. Like it felt like backtracking didn't feel good. A lot of on-rail sections. The platforming is a bit clunky. Like so. I don't know. Like, I like the collectibles, even cosmetics. Like, it's maybe too many, but I kind of like cosmetics. Like, every now and then I would change BD's coat of paint, or like put on a new shirt, or like make my lightsaber silver with, like a blue blade or whatever. Like, I like playing with the collectibles, and the environments were cool, but like the exploration, the gating, like backtracking, the navigation, just not that good. Like, and so kind of leaning into collectibles, I understand why they did it, but I found that sometimes that was actually just not like a fun way to play, especially before you just had everything unlocked. And even then it was kind of tedious at times.
Yeah. I think like I get what they were going for with Kobo being the like hub world and having lots of hidden stuff and lots of explorable areas that were completely optional, and that being a place that you are forced to go back to throughout the game with different levels of abilities and ways to explore and open up new paths. So I get that idea. That's not something that is unique to this game. Lots of games do that kind of thing. It just didn't, for whatever reason, things we've already talked about here, just something about I don't know if it was, I can't blame it on just level design or just the collectibles or just the quality of side quests or any one thing, but I just feel like it didn't all quite gel for me in a way that felt good.
Yeah, and I think it is a little bit of all those things too. Like, I don't think it is just one issue. I think there are a handful of issues, and it is a very standard modern AAA video game thing to add a lot of space with collectibles and explorable area. But like, there's not many $60+ games that don't have that anymore.
Right.
I do agree that for me, like, if more of the collectible, I'm not a big cosmetics person, so if like, it would always bum me out when I'd get to the end of like a platforming segment and my reward was like a mullet. And sometimes those platforming segments would be fun, or like the little challenges you'd go through to get the thing, but it was still a little bit of a bummer when it wasn't, because sometimes they're like, if you get an extra stim booster, like that's really substantial gameplay wise.
Right.
So I think, there could have been a little bit better balance of that. Like, I don't mind if it's some collectibles, but but I think more for me, because I think having the one, like, if I think for me having two big planets, Kobo and Jeddah, was, I think I would have preferred it to just be Kobo, because when I got to Jeddah and it was like, oh, here's another big explorable space, I was like, no. Like, by that point, I was like,
I can't do this.
I had wasted too much time on Kobo, that I just didn't even bother exploring really any of Jeddah. But I think also, Ryan, you made the Metroid comparison earlier. Like, in a Metroid game, you lose all your abilities at the start, and have to regain them. But there's also a comparison to be made of the way Metroid like handles backtracking and how it makes use of its ability gates is one. I mean, Super Metroid's been analyzed to death over the years, but one thing Super Metroid does very well is if you're going down a path that is gated by an ability you don't have, the Super Metroid usually puts the gate early in the path, so you don't wander too far before you realize you don't have the ability. And one thing I ran into a lot with Jedi Survivor is Kobo is a very big area in a 3D space. Super Metroid's a 2D game, obviously, but I spent a lot of time early on on Kobo going down long paths only to realize near the end, oh, I don't have an ability for this. And that didn't feel great, because it feels like you get 80% of the way down a path and then hit the wall, and it just feels like wasted time.
Yeah, it felt like a huge waste of time, yeah.
And those spaces are just so big, too, that you don't have a lot of options for moving super quickly, especially early in the game.
Yeah.
So it just takes forever to move through those spaces on Kobo and Jeddah because they're both just really big maps.
Yes.
And maybe in a sense, that I don't remember that being as much and like we talked about, it's Fallen Order was a lot more linear. Like maybe that's just a better fit? Question mark. Like I don't know. Like but yeah, I do remember like some of the navigation and gating and backtracking just in this game felt very slow and not. I like the collectibles and sometimes I liked getting them, but when I was actually like actively looking for collectibles, I found that a lot of times I would do a couple and then just kind of bounce off of it because either like navigating or running into gates or whatever, I would just get frustrated a little. So like, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like from my memory of Fallen Order, it was more like intertwining corridors than big open fields, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like Kobo and Jeddah are a lot of interconnected large open fields, and most of the areas in Fallen Order were like very tight pathways that you go from like encounter to encounter or puzzle to puzzle. And they kind of loop back in on themselves in that Metroidy way, and it just it was just quicker to move from one end of the map to another because it wasn't these giant open spaces.
Yeah, I think for me that is a lot of it is that Fallen Order was just it was just a tighter game with smaller spaces that loop back in more quickly. So even if you hit a dead end, you didn't have to go so far, and there just wasn't like Jedi Survivor just has a lot of space. So you just spend a lot of time traversing space, and there's not always stuff in that space that's really that interesting. Which maybe there's a point to be made about that being a good thing, and games not always just giving you space. But I think maybe for me in my brain as someone who does kind of like Metroidy, who does often like Metroidy games, like I think I appreciate the tighter level design more, where the shortcuts looping back in and the pathways are more intentionally crafted and not so spacious, if that makes sense. It certainly helps with with it not feel like it's wasting your time, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
I guess maybe segueing a little bit off of talking about exploration, did the actual movement through the areas affect like any of the navigating, backtracking, exploring, looking for collectibles? Like, we talked about some of the gating and stuff, but how about actually like kind of getting through the areas, like maybe doing wall running sections or climbing sections? You guys have any thoughts about?
I think. Go ahead, Justin.
I think, and that is a good segue because, like, I think it's worth talking about the platforming and the movement, and I do think there are times where the platforming in this game does feel really good. Like wall running remains a cool thing to do in a video game, and Jedi Survivor gives you plenty of opportunities to do it. And I think when they have, this is maybe beating the same drum a little bit, I think when they have tighter spaces that are designed as like, oh, this is like a platforming gauntlet, like I think that can be very fun. I think when I don't enjoy the platforming as much as and exploring is when there's too much space, when there is too much time moving along more flat ground where you're not really doing anything interesting, or, which is going to get us into the pacing problem that we'll probably talk about soon here, or when you're just kind of doing the same platform actions over and over again, which to me is my personal biggest gripe with this game, is the pacing and being repetitive. I also think the other comment I'll make about this is, I think if I had waited to explore Kobo after I had all the abilities, it would have been a lot more fun. And I think I spent too much time early on before I had the dash and before I had whatever other abilities you get later in the game that Point being, you get things later that make exploring the bigger spaces easier and snappier and more fun. So I think maybe part of this is on me, but I think I spent too much time trying to explore Kobo when I didn't actually have the abilities that would make it fun to do so, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's what the game wants you to do. I think it's pretty clear about that it wants you to keep poking away at the edges of Kobo every time you come back there, and I just don't think that process is super fun in this game.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense. I think as we talked about, like, I ran into I think after, in that first time I got to Kobo, I started poking around and hit like a couple gates, and I was like, this is annoying. And so I kind of gave up on Kobo, like almost like we talked about, until the very end, because every time it felt like I would try to explore Kobo or anywhere else, but Kobo I think maybe is the worst offender. It was like I would just run into some other lock. And I don't like that in Metroidvania design in general, but in this game in particular, I just don't think it also is. It's like I don't want to smash my face into a wall just for another cosmetic, like, unless there's something particularly interesting about it. Like, I don't like hitting that wall when I know that most of what I'll find is just kind of like fun little knickknacks and stuff anyway. But I guess the only other thing I wanted to mention about platforming is how about all that climbing?
Yeah, and here's maybe our good segue to the pacing, because to me a lot of the pacing problem is largely in the platforming, because I don't know if you guys had the same reaction, but I feel like there are frequent sections in this game that's like an hour plus of just platforming, of climbing, of jumping, of wall running, and like that stuff's cool as I said before, in like a tight, like well-designed, intentional space. But yeah, you ask about all that climbing, and there are a lot of segments in this game where you are climbing for a long time on a story mission without much story happening, and it kind of boggles my mind how long some of these segments are. Like, did you guys have the same reaction? Like, as you're going through, like, I had multiple, like, at least a half dozen times in this game, like, going through a story mission, half an hour or more in, being like, how is this climbing section still going?
Yeah, I definitely had some of that. And, like,
look, man, when you're a Jedi, you don't walk anywhere, okay? Especially when you're a Jedi Master. Sorry.
Yeah. No, you're fine. It's one of these. This is probably one of the most like mixed things I feel about this game, because in some ways I think platforming and wall running and air dashing and all that stuff, and combining that with parts of the environment, like, feels pretty good at a micro level, and like they have some of like the grand vistas and like cool ideas about what you're climbing and like what you're looking at, and like have companion characters with you to do some banter. And so I'm like, the best version of this game is like doing a lot of the same stuff as an Uncharted, which you called out earlier, but like I would like it better than probably Uncharted if it really nailed it, because like the movement feels really good, and I like the Star Wars universe and seeing the grandness of it and all that stuff. So like I like a lot of what they do, but yeah, some of those sections I got real fatigued on. Like you said, 20, 30, 40 minutes in, I'm like, okay, can I get up here and deal with this boss fight yet? No? Oh, okay. Let's.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate a point you said, and I kind of mentioned it to a lesser degree earlier. Like, the movement feels good. Like, it is fun. It is genuinely fun to do these actions, to wall run, to air dash, to grapple, to like doing these things is fun. And sometimes they'll even have you do like a force push or pull, like in between these platforming actions. And like like I think they have a really good core like set of platforming mechanics that can often be really fun. And I think that's what is part of what makes it a bummer is like they kind of just they stretch these segments out too long. And there's, as you were talking about like the vistas and stuff, like there's one of the late game areas you go to, and if either of you remember like the name of what it is, but like it's near the end and it's on Kobo and you're like climbing up and up and up and you're going way up to this place very high, like in the clouds, and you end up like bouncing on all those balloons and stuff. And like, it's a really visually impressive sequence, and you're still like doing wall running off like these hanging, like, vertical pieces and jumping on the balloons, because now you have that ability where you can like grapple to and spring off the balloons, and like you're doing some really complicated, because you have most of the abilities at that point, it's late game, and you're doing some really complicated intricate platforming sections, and you've climbed so high up in Kobo that you like the visual vista is really stunning. Like that was probably my favorite area in the game from a visual standpoint. Like it just looked really impressive.
And that was building up to big story moments you knew were coming, because you knew like that was where you were about to confront the villain at that point in the game, and like it was really I was in the same boat. Like I was feeling that section until you get fatigued on it.
Like that's the first 20-ish minutes of that section was like one of my favorite stretches of the game. Like this is just firing on all cylinders. This is fantastic. And even that section probably went on too long, and there are definitely sections before that, because that's late game. Like you've already gone through multiple platforming sections that are too long before you get to that point. So like it really does, to me, feel this game largely feels like a case of like if they just had like an editor really like. If all these sections had just got honed down to like, the right amount, the right length, and the right, pacing, like I think a lot of our complaints would be going away, and be like, oh yeah, like each of these story missions is like a tightly tuned platforming gauntlet leading to some climactic battles and stuff.
Yeah, I think you guys both said it. I agree pretty much. Like, so I said it earlier, like, I think this game has gameplay elements that are fun. It just doesn't play to its strengths a lot. And then kind of echoing, like, especially, it's not just the climbing, like some of the wall running and stuff is also a bit too long, but it's like so I guess sometimes I was wondering, I was like, why do games put these climbing sections in anyway, right? Because gameplay-wise, a lot of times you're just holding an arrow, right? Like you're holding a direction, you might press X to jump on or off here or there, like, but a lot of times, Jedi Survivor had a ton of these sections where you're just clinging to a wall or like shimmying over like, a beam or whatever, and like you're just holding forward, and Cal's doing all this complicated climbing, but I'm just holding like right or left or up or down or whatever. And like you said, Nate, I think whenever it's like a pace setter, and whenever, Cal and BD or Marin are going back and forth, some banter, and like, or, you're, like you said, the Kobo mountaintops, and you see these just kind of awesome Star Wars vistas, like the environments in this game. The game has some awesome, like, Star Wars settings, some really super cool environments. That's where it feels like those climbing sections play to its strengths, but then sometimes, it's just on the story missions, it's such a pace killer, or if you're backtracking to look for collectibles, it's like, I just rolled my eyes, because so many sections of exploration are just literally like grapple to a wall and like, spend like 10 seconds shimmying off to a side or whatever. There's no gameplay there, right? You just press L2 to grapple, and then you hold the right stick for like 20 seconds or whatever while Cal is like shifting over. So anyway,
so that's probably my single, like, I mean, there are other frustrations I have with the game too, but that's probably my single biggest frustration with this whole game, honestly, is just the length of some of those segments really can drag it down, combined with the exploration of Kobo that we talked about.
Yeah.
But when it's firing, I do think the platforming is legitimately cool.
Yeah.
Like the good moments of it are really good, and I think to transition here, the other like core part that I do think is really good at its core that maybe has some issues around the edges is the combat. Um, and so I guess how do you guys feel? I mean, how do you guys feel about the combat overall? It's fairly similar, I guess, to Fallen Order. Just they've added, you know, we have more abilities now, and of course we have the stances. So, like, did you like it in Fallen Order? Do you still like the combat here? Do you like the addition of the stances? Like, how do you feel about all that stuff?
Yeah.
I liked them both. I liked the new stances, so ended up picking or sticking with the two new stances to this game, which is the blaster stance and the crossguard stance.
Oh wow.
So
those
I
were my
heard
main two.
I did not use the crossguard, but on a lot of podcasts and things I listened to, apparently it's OP. Did you feel that way?
I did. Oh, I felt like both of those were pretty OP once I got the hang of them. So the blaster stance lets you just kind of pelt enemies from a distance, which is really useful for just like not letting someone's stamina recharge, or some enemies don't even block the blaster, so you'll just do health damage to them even if they're at full stamina, which is a little silly.
And it is pretty satisfying. I don't know if you use the charge shot, but like sometimes like an enemy would be running forward and Cal would just like shoot them like with the charge blaster in the face. They would just go flying backwards.
Yeah.
What if a Jedi just said, "I'm gonna shoot him with a gun"?
That's right. Cal knows what's up. And then the crossguard is like you're playing Dark Souls with a great sword. It's like the big wind ups, heavy damage, short combos, that kind of thing. Very wide, slow swings. And so yeah, it just does a ton of damage. So once you get the timings down, you can just melt dudes. And it also sends stormtroopers flying real good.
which is always fun.
Yeah, like if we're really gonna rate Star Wars games on how good they are, it's like how much can you send stormtroopers go flying? Then this one does that pretty well.
Preserves the
And also, how satisfying is it to redeflect blaster bolts back at stormtroopers, which this game also does very well.
Preserves the Jedi Academy tradition. Just like deflecting bolts and pushing stormtroopers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I feel like this game combines all the elements you would expect and want from like a Star Wars Jedi third-person action game, refines a lot of what and expands on a lot of what Fallen Order did. I feel like the combat encounters generally are pretty like they're not particularly unique across the whole game, but it always felt like I had to engage the right amount. Like it was never just quite going through the motions for the most part. You have to pay a little bit of attention to your timings and when to deflect and when to dodge and that kind of stuff. So it felt very active and responsive to me, and fighting against groups of enemies with a lightsaber is just satisfying.
Yeah, I guess for myself, so I did like the combat in Fallen Order. I think it was pretty good as a dueling game too, which is funny because it came out around the same time as Sekiro, which is just like one of the best dueling games.
Yeah.
So it got a little bit one-upped like around the same time it came out, but it was still like, especially for a game with lightsabers, just they really stepped up the combat, I think, from a lot of previous Star Wars titles. And I think one thing that so in Fallen Order, I primarily used the single lightsaber and the dual blade occasionally. But I think you had access to all three stances when you got them.
I think so.
In Jedi Survivor, they limit you to two. At each rest point, you can equip two of, I guess, now 5 stances, which was an interesting... And I liked it. I thought it was cool, but it was interesting that they made that that choice to constrain you to 2 instead of 3. I used the the two dual lightsabers. I used two lightsabers as kind of my primary stance, and the blaster as my secondary.
Yep.
I tested out each one. Crossguard did seem really powerful, but I think the thing, and again, I complained a little bit about how this game doesn't always play to its strengths. Like, I think the dueling combat in this game is very good, but it chooses to throw a lot of group battles, especially towards the back half of the game. Every battle just has a ton of enemies, and that really undercuts the ability to like have these one-on-one duels, because like you break an enemy's stamina and then another one just comes up and hits you, or like gets in your way. Or you'll spend the whole battle like dodging these unblockable attacks. So for that, I found like the crossguard was not very useful because the slow attack animations, but then the blaster sometimes was useful because it's just like, all right, well, if this is how it's going to be, like I'm just going to walk backwards and like shoot until I run out of ammo.
Yeah.
So I did find that bit of design annoying, where it had a really good dueling game, but then it insisted on making it not a dueling game.
I'm that is one of my complaints with the combat and combat design is exactly what you said, Ryan. In the back half of the game, there's a lot of encounters with a lot of enemies, and I don't think that's this game's strength. For me, found that kind of tedious or annoying sometimes, even though like I did like the combat overall, but I do think it's better with less enemies or more dueling type scenarios.
What were your weapons of choice, Flex?
Mine were actually the same as yours, Ryan. I used the dual wielding and blaster. After testing them all, I mostly played dual wielding. I played a very aggro style, just. So I don't know if that led to us being more annoyed by the being like encounters with tons of enemies or not, but in theory, I don't see why the other stances would necessarily do better at that, but I don't know. I wasn't switching around a lot late game, so I didn't exactly test out those battles.
It's a little hard to say because this game doesn't just throw skill points at you, so maxing out and respecking was actually kind of a challenge. But from what I tested, I mean, the crossguard, sometimes I found in those wide groups, like I would just get poked a lot in the like multi-enemy encounters while I was trying to wind up those big like two-handed swings. And the dual blades did have that kind of like, I think it's like you hold lock and press the triangle button and you do this like little sweep and backstep, which that was pretty good. Like that was one of the better AoE attacks I found of any of the weapons.
Yeah, my go-to for large groups was the blaster stance more often, because it has a very hit and run style of play where you're like dashing in and out and getting pot shots in while you're moving around, which felt good, especially if there were like the weakest types of enemies, like regular stormtroopers or like the ones with the rocket launchers or like regular battle droids. You could just like mow them down with the blaster really efficiently while moving around the arena, and that was always really satisfying. The other thing that I did actually early in this game is I didn't put any points into any of the stances because I wasn't sure what I wanted to use. I put all my points into force powers.
Oh.
And so I use a lot of force powers in combat to throw people around and like pick them up and throw them into each other, or when you get the lift and slam abilities, you can lift up groups of enemies too to like neutralize whole groups. So like that part was fun to me too.
I did wonder if, because the game gives you, I think mind control is kind of a new power, and towards the later part of the game I did start to put more talent points in that. I did wonder if that was sort of meant to be their coping mechanism for some of these group battles, is to like start mind controlling some of them. But I don't know. Yeah, it was I didn't, even after I invested more in them and I did see how they were potentially useful, I didn't use them a lot. Although when I fought the flame troopers, I found that if you slammed the flame troopers, they would explode. So I started I started slamming flame troopers every time I encountered them.
One of my favorite things to do was the stormtroopers with the riot shield was to just pull the shield away from you had to get an upgraded version of the pull from the Force skill tree to do, but you could just pull the shield away from them and throw it back, and it would one hit kill them. They would always just pop up, and I was like, nope.
Yeah, and I think all those Force abilities, because the mind control was one of my go-tos, and definitely one of the things I leaned into even more in the back half of the game. But yeah, I think all the Force abilities are really fun things in this game that do kind of give it a little bit of its own identity compared to like a Sekiro or something. So it is nice to have those. I didn't end up using the lift or the slam as much as I probably should have, but I definitely ended up using your basic pull and push a lot, and I use mind control a lot. So and throwing my lightsaber as well. Like all of those things I use. I mean, force pushing a stormtrooper off a ledge never gets old.
Yeah. Plus, throwing the lightsaber with the crossguard is hilarious because it's like you're throwing a boulder, and if you get the upgraded version, it will go through a whole line of people and knock them all down. It's just completely decimate.
Yeah, for sure. Is there any other combat stuff we want to touch on here?
I don't think so.
I guess we have 3 blaster users.
Yeah, blaster.
This is the developer. Just as the developers intended.
You give us a gun, we're going to use it. Apparently.
Yeah, I feel like at this point in Star Wars, if you say you can have a lightsaber in one hand and a blaster in the other hand, most people are going to be like, "Yes, please, thank you."
We no longer use the weapon for the more civilized time.
No.
Not a civilized age. Yeah. So there's no more more combat specific. I think we might start transitioning to more narrative topics here. And one thing to kind of bridge the combat and narrative, I guess, is one thing this game does, which I simultaneously like and also simultaneously think's very kind of silly, is it brings together enemies and things from all areas of Star Wars.
This is actually one of my main points I wanted to talk about, so I'm glad you brought it up.
Yeah, so to some degree, I got kind of disappointed with the enemy variety in this game but I think that's more of a bloatedness issue than anything. And what we were talking about, we spend so long in these segments that I just get tired of fighting the enemies. Because when I take a step back, it's no, it actually does have good variety. It's just maybe stretched over too much space. But yeah, I mean, you get the first time you roll up on battle droids, prequel era battle droids. I'm like, what are we doing here? But it's not just that. They're pulling from almost any of the types of enemies you can think of from the prequels. You're getting your stormtroopers and more. Episode 4, approaching episode 4 era stuff. You get kind of everything in between, and you even get a little bit of High Republic stuff in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of pulling from any Star Wars thing you can think of. It's pulling enemies from.
This game absolutely feels like the crossroads of where Star Wars is at in its current canon, and it just has at least one tie to everything. There's direct ties to the Obi-Wan Kenobi show from last year. There's direct ties to the High Republic, as you mentioned, which is their big new push outside of the Skywalker saga. It's very strange.
Yeah, and I go back and forth on whether I like it or think it's just too dumb. Or
it is very silly.
Interesting, I guess. I did notice it a little bit, especially when you first encounter battle droids.
Mm-hmm.
Although, so the Purge Troopers, are those unique to Fallen Order, or were those in something like Rebels? Both Fallen Order and Survivor, the Purge Troopers are.
I don't know for sure. I feel like they exist elsewhere, but I don't know that for sure.
That was a big focus in. I feel like, but yeah, in this game, I mean, I think from a timeline perspective, it's kind of after after episode 3, maybe
Yeah, so
somewhere
I
before.
looked this up before. I think because Order 66 was in a flashback sequence in Fallen Order, which was one of the coolest moments of that game. And I think Fallen Order was 5 or 10 years after that, and this Survivor is, I know it's 5 years after Fallen Order. I can probably look this up, but yeah, we are in between episode 3 and 4.
Yeah,
pretty firm, probably closer to episode 4 at this point, or maybe halfway-ish in between. It's definitely in that period.
Yeah, seeing.
Okay, yeah, sorry.
Seeing
Jedi Fallen Order is 5 years after Revenge of the Sith, episode 3, and then Survivor is 5 years after that. So we are 10 years post episode 3.
Maybe getting close to like Rogue One or episode 4 or something. But anyway, so seeing like battle droids, especially when they're kind of marketed as like, oh, we lost the war and some of this old, kind of works. It's Star Wars kind of. I mean, you go to these different planets, there's different technology. But I guess you do raise a good point. Like, finding a Rancor in the cave of Kobo, it's just like, that was kind of weird. It was like, so there's just like a Rancor like chilling out in this cave.
Like,
and that's kind of the point I'm making, is like any even remotely iconic Star Wars thing you could fight is somewhere in this game. Like they pull everything.
ATATs in the desert.
You fight ATSTs. You fight. Which I mean, I guess is fine. It's just
I'm not really mad at it. It is just like one of those things that as I was playing it, I was like, okay, yep, another reference here. Okay.
Yeah.
So I guess, and we were kind of segueing into story, which is something that I do like a lot about Jedi Survivor. In a lot of ways, I think it's a direct continuation of Fallen Order, and there's some character development. I think the character acting and character development is generally very good. The continuation of that story, and actually how they raise the stakes in a way that feels very Star Wars, but it also like is very fitting in my mind. Like as the story progresses, it's like, well, what are we kind of know how the Star Wars stories plays out, right? But we're focused on Cal Kestis, so it's like, how are they going to make a story that makes sense within this universe that also kind of fits with something that would motivate these characters, not as just like kind of hopeless rebels or whatever, right? But giving them something like to work towards. So I mean, I don't know if you want to start with like sort of the beginning and the continuation from Jedi Fallen Order. Start from the beginning, or
I don't want to really go through the plot point by point, but I think there's a lot of kind of bigger themes that we can hit. I mean, it is a direct sequel. I mean, it takes 5 years later, but it is a direct sequel from Fallen Order. That game, a lot of the characters were there. Marin, Grease. Why am I blanking on the
Seer?
Seer. Yes, thank you. Yeah. They're like your main crew, and BD. And you kind of split with them, and you end up reconciling with them in this game. And I think all those characters are still great. Like,
yeah, they are.
Yeah, well, and as you mentioned, kind of like it's continued from Fallen Order, and each of the characters has gone like a different way. Cal in particular, who's sort of the one you follow a lot, he's still fighting the Empire, so that's kind of the path he's chosen. But there is this bit in the story where they all split up, and that's something that kind of shows up right in the story. Like, it's unspoken for a bit, but he's kind of disappointed, right? He's like, I don't understand. Like, I felt like we needed to continue this fight. Like, I don't know what else to do. And as he talks to the different characters, like, and sees the paths that they've chosen, one thing I did like is that, it's not like a very angsty thing, right? It's like, kind of like, oh, Cal as he meets these other characters, he's like, oh, I see, why you did what you did. Like, he's like, it's kind of he's not like bitter or hurtful or angsty or whatever. He's just like, oh, he kind of comes to terms with it uh, in a pretty cool way. I feel like early on, sort of, I guess, early in the plot ish.
Yeah,
it's kind of hard to like map out. Like I think for me, the beginning of this game is very slow, even though it starts kind of like in the middle of an action sequence, sort of on the Coruscant mission that you start on. But like, because there is that hanging question of like, oh, where's the crew from the last game? And they don't really address that right away. And like that part, which I do like everything that you talked about, Ryan, and how they get back together and reconcile. I think it is done very well. But like the part of the game where you start and that's just an open question, which is fine, combined with how that first mission goes, which is basically like everybody except for Cal and his new buddy Bode,
who like goes off screen.
Yeah, got on this mission that goes bad, and that kind of sets the stage for what is going to be this next chapter of Cal's fight against the Empire. Like, I think I spent too long in this game confused about what this game was going to be about.
Yeah,
that makes sense. I was like, what are we doing?
Yeah, it does make sense because I like, maybe this is a little naive of me, but I thought for a while, even after a lot of your initial crew just got offed, like I thought we were going to have more new characters and more like Cal going on missions and meeting new people. Like I thought we were like maybe hitting a little bit of a reset. Because it does start kind of slow in that way, and he doesn't really link up necessarily for a while. And Bode's there, of course. So like, I thought maybe we would like kind of be getting a new Cal story in a way, and I kind of like the angle that they were starting with of Cal. Like he's trying to figure out some way that he can make a difference fighting the Empire, which just constantly feels like this insurmountable task for him. But then he does not actually isn't going off making new friends really for long in this game, because he does relatively quickly he meets up with Grease and starts getting the band back together, so to speak.
Yeah, but even once you meet Grease, I feel like on Kobo, he's the first one you link back up with. Still at that point, like you're just kind of hanging out, like waiting for something to happen. Like, I don't know. It's not that I hated the moment to moment of what was happening. Like the opening mission on Coruscant was cool, and going to Kobo and seeing what Grease is up to and talking to him and seeing them try to like feel out where their friendship is at was fine. I don't have any problem with that. And for some reason, I think I was just in my head, like, and I think that also this is part of what I was talking about earlier, where the pacing of trying to go out and explore kind of like dislodged me from the narrative in a lot of spots. This is one spot where I really felt that, because when you get to Kobo and start exploring all that stuff, it really took me out of whatever I was supposed to be getting as like the narrative hooks for what this game was going to be. So I'm like 8 hours into this game, like, what is this game about? I don't know yet.
So I had one kind of real big narrative thing I wanted to talk about with this game, and we're kind of already leading right to it, which is like, I still, after having finished the game, still do not have a firm grasp on what's the big deal with Tanalorr. Like, why does everyone care about Tanalorr? So we get exactly what you're saying is we just get kind of hours, a good half dozen or more hours of kind of meandering. And it's like, we know Cal wants to fight the Empire, but he doesn't really know how to do that, or he has all these doubts, doesn't feel like he can do that. And it's like, he kind of gets stranded on Kobo a little bit. So like, some of the meandering is contextualized by like, oh, it's taking Grease time to fix the ship or whatever.
Yeah. And it feels like it's all stage setting. It feels like they're all setting up what the story is going to be about. It just does that for a long time.
Yeah. It takes a while and then you get all this reveal about Tanalorr and stuff.
Yeah.
And then even for me, I still didn't have a great sense of like, why, if that makes sense. And I still, even past that point, like for most of the game, I'm like, what is Cal really after here? Like, what is his overall goal? And like, they try and linchpin it on Tanalorr at that point, but it's still like, I kind of, for the whole game, even once they made the discovery about Tanalorr and he discovered all the High Republic stuff, I was like, I never really had a great sense of like, what is our overall goal here? We just kind of started chasing Dagan Gera for some reason.
Who was also just trying to get to Tanalorr for some reason.
Yeah, and maybe I sped through too much there, but like to the point you were getting at is like I did struggle with this game of like kind of finding the through line, and I think games in general, this is maybe not universally true, but I do think storytelling in video games can be hard sometimes, and I think a lot of games can do better by keeping things pretty simple. So like Fallen Order, I think, did pretty well of like, oh, we're trying to recover the holocron. Is that what it's called?
Jedi holocron, yeah.
Yeah, so like it was established pretty early that like, hey, this holocron is very important.
Right.
It has a list of Jedi children on it, which would be bad if it fell into the Empire's hands.
Right.
And like, so it was a very clear central driving force through the whole game.
It was much clearer.
Yeah, and I think that works to have, and you can have, of course, like side, like you can have other story threads come in and out of that, but I think having like a clear central thing can work very to a game's benefit. And I don't know that I ever felt that for this game from start to finish. It did feel a little more meandering. I think at the moment it ended, I kind of like started piecing some of it together. I'm like, okay, I kind of see what they were going for here, but a lot of the steps along the way was like, I'm not sure what our like ultimate push through this is. And I don't know if, and I guess maybe my question is like, is that intentional? Was it intended to be like Cal himself doesn't even know what he's doing here? Or
I think it could be. Like, I definitely think the opening of this game is intended to show Cal kind of adrift and looking for something to cling to, and Tanalorr becomes that. And I think the reason that I understood why Tanalorr was important is just because it is hard to access and kind of hidden in this weird nebula near Kobo. So it ends up being kind of this like potentially safe house is what he sees it as from the Empire.
Yeah, that is interesting because I mean, I did like the story, and maybe some of that is pacing, like we talked about. I didn't do as much of the like meandering around Kobo. Although, and occasionally, the main story, as we talked about, it would be a bit slow to get from section to section. But I do remember, I mean, they weren't always explicit about it. And there were times where I was like, I'm pretty sure I know what you're going for here, but it wouldn't hurt for you to like be a little bit more clear. But at the same time, I think in my mind, like the reasoning, the logic was actually pretty, I mentioned it earlier, like I felt like it created a very good, because like I said, as a player, we know like kind of the Star Wars story, right? The Empire is not going to be taken down until Luke Skywalker blows up the Death Star in 20 years or whatever. So like, we see Cal kind of have this bad mission. He lands on Kobo to visit Greaves. He kind of finds this kind of key or pathway to this hidden planet that would be safe from the Empire, right? So safe from the Empire, like a place to survive. Like, and then shortly after, you go visit Seer, and you realize that she's working with sort of this underground network, right? This hidden path. And so I think they did kind of say, and like Bode is like, oh, you were going to give it to them, even when they didn't really spell that out sometimes. I think there were occasionally a little bit of, like, I can see, like, Cal meets Seer, who's leading the hidden path. They're going to use Tanalorr as a safe place to hide from the Empire, to hide these refugees. Like, there's this whole organization hiding refugees. Like, that's kind of their whole mission, but there were times where they didn't really say it explicitly. And so in particular, when Bode betrays Cal, like, the betrayal wasn't too surprising because he kept sneaking off screen, and it's like, it was surprising when he pulled out the lightsaber, though. That was a really cool moment. But him, like, kind of going off the rails and being like, oh, you're going to give it to the hidden path, that it was like there was no cooperation or compromise. Like, he's just going to take his daughter and get there to safety, and like, and that was part of his like dark side story arc, right? Is that he was fixated on protecting his daughter to the point where he was actually kind of willing to even like, hurt her or whatever. But yeah, there were I thought it was really smart. Like, I thought it was it was kind of a goal that fit the story perfectly, and that they kind of wove together, like, some of the motivations of like Cal and Marin and Seer kind of like trying to work with this group and maybe use it as like a sanctuary for refugees and for Jedi remnants and things like that.
Yeah, I think I generally got that as the driving motivation for Cal and Seer once they all kind of linked up and understood what Tanalorr's potential was for their hidden path, trying to avoid the Empire and save people. The part that I never figured out and still don't know is what the heck Dagan Gera wanted to get to Tanalorr so bad for.
Yeah, I think two things. I think for me, what would have helped with Cal is like maybe I needed like an extra scene or two of him making the turn from, because at the beginning of the game he was very, we got to do whatever we can to fight the Empire, and he was a little frustrated with the crew disbanding because he felt like they were giving up and all this stuff, and like maybe I needed an extra scene or two to see him move from a place of, no, we have to do whatever we can to fight the Empire, to getting to a place of, no, now my primary goal is kind of taking people away from the fight to Tanalorr to be safe. And I know they had some conversations around that, but maybe it's just me. Maybe something about me, it didn't fully sink in, and I could have used an extra scene or two to get that shift from Cal.
I think that's totally fair.
I think also what makes me like have that reaction of like, what is so special about Tanalorr is exactly what you just said, which is I don't understand why not just Cal, like why everyone else, like kind of collectively, why everyone is kind of pointing to Tanalorr as this weird special thing. Because I don't know that I understand what Dagan Gera's obsession with Tanalorr was. And I'm not even sure I understand what Centauri Kree's thing was. Like, they were building an academy on Tanalorr, right? So was it meant to be an academy that was just more safe, or like why was that more special?
That's why it doesn't make sense to me. So you get the flashbacks to the High Republic era, which is where Dagan Gera is from. And they are planning on building a Jedi temple on Tanalorr once they find it, because the Force is strong there, or something to that effect.
Okay.
And then they get chased off by bad guys of the High Republic era, and the Council tells them, we're nixing that plan, scrap it. We're done with Tanalorr.
Right.
And Dagan Gera, I guess that's enough to like make him go dark side crazy. It doesn't quite make sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't quite follow. I didn't quite follow his turn there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, and some of this maybe gets into like this extended universe perspective of like, I don't know in the canonical Star Wars, like, Jedi temples and things like that, whereas maybe in properties like Jedi Academy and some of the old like extended universe stuff around like Sith Lords, like kind of these places of power, where they build like weapons or temples or whatever, that seems to be a bit more of a kind of an extended universe concept. And then, as you mentioned, like this game, Jedi Survivor, seems to, because the dark side is like a thread throughout all this, or most of the Star Wars properties, and they touch on it with Cal a little bit here, in interesting ways, I guess. But like with Bode, his fixation on keeping his daughter safe after his wife dies, kind of like it's interesting because this is true of all Star Wars, but I like the way that Jedi Survivor kind of explores it, in that for Bode and Dagan Gera, it's like a fixation, right? It's for Dagan Gera, he's like, this is my life work, right? Like navigating this nebula, building this temple, I'm not going to leave it. And like, I guess you see it with Anakin Skywalker as well, right? Like in episode 3, like it becomes like such a fixation that like, it kind of turns them evil. And that's like how Star Wars, in some cases, that's how they treat this like transition to the dark side, is sometimes it's just like one thing that you obsess over. And I guess because you have this power, it starts to like, it starts to manifest, like corrupt you or whatever. It's interesting. Like, with Cal, it seemed like it was going to be his fight against the Empire, right? He was always worried, like, or, I guess there was always this, like, is he going to become so obsessed with that, that becomes a thing. And then when Bode betrays him, like taking revenge on Bode, like he starts to kind of like lose it a little bit there. So I don't know. It's interesting, like some of those Star Wars themes but yeah, I guess in terms of like why would they even care about building a Jedi temple, like that one's not even kind of necessarily like in canonical Star Wars that I know of, but it does show up a bit more. If you think about like Knights of the Old Republic and some of the lore that those kind of games might build around, like it would fit maybe more in that kind of lore space.
Yeah, I mean, the little bit I do know about the High Republic era is like it's an era where the Jedi are very powerful and very like cohesive, right? They're like a large scale unit that works together to solve problems galaxy wide, and they have like outposts everywhere. So I don't think this game particularly sold me on why Tanalorr mattered so much to Dagan Gera, other than maybe it was, I think like it could have been something where it was more about his relationship with Centauri Kree and how like that was their thing that they were doing together. But I don't think they sold that necessarily in the scenes that we got of them. So I ended up just feeling very confused about why he was so focused on Tanalorr. I do think, as you talked about, Bode and his eventual turn, or his showing of his turn, I guess, like ended up working for me, even though in the moment I was like, what? What is happening here?
In the moment, like when he betrays you, or when he pulls out the lightsaber?
No, when he pulls out a lightsaber and starts using force powers, I was like, okay, game.
That was a surprise. I was not surprised because they foreshadow little bits that he might be a traitor or a mole. But then, yeah, when he pulls out the lightsaber, I was like, oh, wow.
Yeah.
I thought in the moment that I was a little bit a little bit much, even for Star Wars for me. But by the end, I was okay with it, and I think that they did sell it pretty well. And I feel like I generally understood his motivations and what kind of had happened to him and his family pretty well. So I think they did do that.
Yeah, and I think Bode is the one person who I did understand his obsession with Tanalorr. Is he had reached through everything that had happened to him. He reached that point where he's like, I just want out. I don't want to deal with the Empire or anyone.
Yeah,
like I just don't want to deal with this anymore. And he just wanted to get to somewhere where nobody else could bother him.
Yep.
Or his daughter. And I think Bode works well as a like kind of a mirror for Cal in a way, or like a reflection point of, Cal started off very focused on fighting the Empire, and then starts searching for Tanalorr as like a safe haven, and Bode is that extreme. He has that obsession, like we said, with finding it, and kind of like how getting that far to that extreme, like how that looks, and that was shown in Bode, which I guess by the end kind of pulled Cal back a little bit towards like, no, we can't like fully just run away in that degree.
Yeah. But I do want to touch on again one of the points you brought up, Ryan, of when Bode turns on Cal and kills Cordova, and takes the key to Tanalorr. You then get, I think it's only after that point, I'm pretty sure, where you start getting the ability to embrace the dark side as Cal. And like, I was surprised by that a little bit. They went that direction, and even more than I was surprised they decided to have him dip to the dark side a little bit, because that's been a theme in Fallen Order 2, is characters kind of like having a moment where they slip into the dark side. Like that's a big part of Seer's character arc, is like her struggle with the dark side. I thought it was really interesting that they not only let him dip into the dark side and had that manifest narratively and mechanically in the game, but they don't even attempt to resolve it in this game.
Yeah, I thought that was weird too, and I read a number of headlines after finishing this game as I was like poking around with stuff of like, is Cal the first gray Jedi or something like that? Which I read those headlines and I'm like, kind of whatever. But or those articles. But like, yeah, because I agree with you completely that like they don't, like in every other Star Wars thing I've ever engaged with, like that is a huge, huge deal.
Right.
Even to just dip your toes into the dark side. Like it's kind of this like thing of like, oh, once you start dipping in, it's so hard to pull back. And we see so many portrayals throughout all Star Wars media of like how hard it is to pull back. And Cal does it like it's nothing. He's like, yeah, I can embrace the dark side and get really powerful for 2 minutes while I push both L3, R3 and go all Kratos on people, or, and then I can stop it on a dime just as easily. Like he never has that moment that every other Jedi tempted by the dark side has of like going too far. He seems to just handle it just like a champ.
Well, but do you think that they've definitively said he has able to fully come back from it? Because I feel like it's left open at the end. Like, is he going to have to continue to contend with this side of him now in the next game?
I guess so, maybe. I guess when I say come back is like he's still... Usually when we see people portrayed as the dark side, they become just like really ruthless and
Right.
like, single-minded and fixated on what they want, and Cal is still able to like see the bigger picture or like do things for other people. Like he still cares for other people in the way that most Dark Jedi don't.
Well, and I mean, I think I may be wrong about this, but even circling back to like the original trilogy, like I think you see it in like Darth Vader taunting Luke and Luke starting to kind of like lose his cool, and like he gets a little bit more powerful, but then he kind of like is like, wait, no, this isn't me. Like, I'm not, versus like that fixation, right? And so, in some cases it's fixation, or in some cases I guess it's like embracing the anger, the power, or whatever. I think you're right that they do represent, and of course Star Wars is not necessarily consistent, but they usually do represent it as like potentially like intoxicating or corrupting. Like it's very either tempting or like it's hard to see or it's hard to let go of. But there are story threads where like somebody kind of starts down that road and is, I guess that's where they maybe where they try to have like the Jedi teachings, right, of like being careful about too much connection or too much passion. Like that's where the stories kind of like try to have those teachings to kind of like prevent those kind of like stepping down the paths to the dark side. But it's pretty loose, I think. I think some properties handle it differently, but yeah, you're right that it does seem like it becomes more and more of a commitment, or like even the power itself, if it doesn't outright corrupt you, it's just so tempting. But there are cases I think we see where people kind of like use it a little bit and then kind of back away from it.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, and one of the things that because like I definitely noted that like Cal has very strong connections with his crew. Like most obviously when like the relationship with him and Marin builds, but like even before that, like the way he cares about and worries about his crew and his friends is like he's showing a lot more connection than the Jedi teachings would traditionally allow him to. And like I think there's potentially a read on this game that says, oh wait, well, maybe if you let Jedi have those connections, that can make them stronger in a way. And like I could potentially see a read of this where it's like, oh, Cal building those connections that he's built over years has made him more like emotionally intelligent or stronger, such that he can better manage those dark side temptations, so that like, oh, maybe having connections is good actually. And like
maybe we're wrong.
And makes him like a more balanced person emotionally, where he can like control that stuff and not like fall to the temptation of the dark side. I don't know that they like fully sell that, but I could see that as like a potential reading. Anyway, what were you about to say, Nate?
I don't remember, and it doesn't matter. But yeah, I think you could read it that way, and I mean you could read Luke Skywalker the same way in the original trilogy too. Like he has very similar connections to his friends, and it's in the end it's him trying to create his connection with Darth Vader that ends up, ending that conflict and saving Anakin in the final moments. So there's definitely it's not against Star Wars to say that, even if the like prequel era Jedi have a very specific idea about attachments. I definitely thought that that in Act 3 turn and the way they represented the dark side and the way they had Bode and all his motivations come to light. I guess to sum that up, I would say I really like the third act of this game, despite some of my qualms with some of the other narrative. Like I think the beginning of the game is pretty slow. The middle of the game has a lot of pacing issues that we talked about, and a villain that I didn't find particularly compelling or understandable in Dagangara. And then they just like put another story at the end that I was like, okay, we're good now.
Yeah. The more I reflect on Dagangara, the more I'm like, well, it's just like he didn't really do anything. Like I thought like he's a very like his intro and like a lot of the moments with him on screen, like he had a presence. Like you know, he's a very visually striking character, mainly because he only has the one arm, but he's also very strong. And the way he spoke, like he had like a presence with his speech as well. But just like whenever I reflect on the actual story beats of like what he did, it's just like there's kind of just nothing there. And then he kind of just went as quick as he came. Like you just kind of have a final battle with him and he's gone, and it's like, all right, he's dead. And then there's more story after that, and it's like, I feel like something in there could have been more smooth, and I don't know how I feel overall about them even working the High Republic stuff in as a whole, because it kind of feels like, in the end, because like before I started playing this game, like reading reviews and stuff, it's like, oh, this game taps a lot into High Republic stuff, and like that's a huge part of this game. But like when I think about like the plot that actually matters from this game, like the High Republic stuff really had no large bearing on like kind of the core themes of this game. Like it doesn't. Like it ends up being more backdrop, I guess, than anything. It's more of just like an explanation of like how Tanalorr became a thing. But I feel like they and I actually did like watching the like flashback cutscenes with like Centauri Kree and like her discovering like and her and Dagan discovering stuff. Like I thought they were entertaining scenes, but also not necessarily a lot of meat there, if that makes sense. So part of me feels like I could have done without the ties to the High Republic. Like to me, it would have been just as good if Centauri Kree and Dagangara were characters that existed 50 years ago instead of in the High Republic. Like it didn't have to be the High Republic. It could have just been any reasonable amount of time in the past.
I guess, I mean, and again, I mentioned it before, I think this is kind of a bit, I don't know if this is the correct terminology, but almost like extended universe kind of. It's at least very common, if it's not almost a mentality of the extended universe, right? Of like finding old force powers or ancient technology, oftentimes, pointing to the Old Republic or High Republic or whatever. Like, if you think about like Knights of the Old Republic, right? There was the Forge or whatever it was called, like kind of the big thing that Darth Revan was after controlling. Like it's kind of in that vein of like ancient Sith or Jedi relic technology that's kind of out of date, or force powers that are out of date. It's kind of like very much soft magic, wizards in space type stuff, I think. But so I think it's kind of more in line with that. I mean, I thought the reasoning was pretty good, right? They wanted to create a sanctuary that was kind of isolated, and there are probably different ways they could have done that, but just saying, okay, well, the previous generation, or however you want to call the High Republic, discovered a path to this like hidden planet in a nebula using like old technology or whatever. They had the resources, right? They had the ability to spend time researching it. I think that's kind of probably what they were going for with that.
Yeah. I think the thing that takes me out of that a little bit, of like harkening back to another era where they would have been interested in this place in Tanalorr, is because, again, from my limited knowledge about the High Republic, I don't know that that or this game gave me a reason why they actually wanted a hidden place. Because in the High Republic, it's supposed to be like the Republic is very powerful, the Jedi Order is very powerful, the galaxy is mostly at peace. So why did they need a hidden planet kind of thing?
Yeah, what's the motivation? I mean, other than just like purely academic
right.
or research,
and they could have made that argument of like, oh, we think it's very interesting that this planet is secluded and strong with the Force, and we want to commune with that and see if we can learn some deeper mystery of the Force. But I don't even feel like anybody said that, you know?
Yeah, no, I don't think so.
Yeah.
That motivation, I don't know that it was ever really spelled
right.
out, other than just kind of like, we have the technology,
right?
And maybe that's kind of my thing with this game's story as a whole is I do overall like think there are a lot of strong parts of the story, and I think there are a lot of interesting beats, and I think the characters are done pretty well. I think there's like just a handful of things that I'm like, I think they would have like given a little more context or reason behind why they're focusing on this thing they're focusing on, and I think that would have helped me a lot if they had just like given just a little bit of extra like context or reason for some of those things, like like exactly what you two were just describing about Tanalorr.
So one of the last narrative beats that I feel like we should at least touch on, that I have some feelings to share, I guess, is the when the Empire attacks Jeddah, you get the Seer sequence. Vader shows up. How did you guys feel about that whole sequence?
So I wanted to bring that up as well, because I think the thing I was going to say about that is in Fallen Order, they have Darth Vader show up, and it feels very stretched in that game, like very fan servicey. It's like, oh, I guess we're around the Inquisitorius or whatever, so Darth Vader just shows up. That felt unnecessary. In this game, I felt like it actually made sense, because I felt like the story premise was a lot stronger, because if I understand, like, Darth Vader kind of carried out Order 66 personally. It's kind of his thing, and so, like, you know, if there were Jedi, like, a lot of times he would show up.
Yeah, he was the Jedi Hunter in Chief after Episode 3.
So Seer's building this archive, you know, her and Cordova are hiding out. He catches wind of it from boat or whatever. He shows up. Like, I actually thought, I kind of applaud that. And then, you know, I guess because Seer had encounters with him, because all 5 remaining Jedi have had encounters with Darth Vader, like, they have a little bit of banter or whatever. That was okay too, I guess. Yeah, I like that sequence. I thought it was more supported than the Darth Vader cameo from the previous game.
Yeah, and I like that they portrayed Seer as like being able to go toe to toe with Darth Vader. Like, she more than held her own in that fight.
No, I really like that they showed how strong she is. And then at the same time, on the opposite side of the coin, I also really liked that in the end, Vader still won and she died instead of her just getting away. Because I have this problem in current canon Star Wars, is that like every time Vader shows up in something, he ends up looking like a doofus, because he can't ever actually like get any significant wins. So I like that they actually let him get a win here that mattered, but without taking it away from her. But you go ahead.
No,
I was gonna.
Yeah, that was good. I agree with that, because I think it was they did right by both Seer and Darth Vader. Like, they both, in a way, they both kind of won, because like Seer, she might even said as much, but like I think Seer pretty much knew she was going to die.
Yeah, I think so.
But I also think she did better. She handled herself better. I mean, she kind of beat Vader in a way. Like, she matched him. So like it did a good job at showing how strong she was, but also she still had to die, and like it was a good send off for her as a character, and yes, also still showed why Darth Vader is as menacing as he is and is as destructive of a force as he is. So I think they did right by both characters. And we had Seer escape from Vader in the last game, so yeah, we didn't need to have that again.
Yeah, that would have been bad.
Yeah, I guess the only other thing I was going to say is that, and I think this has been true in a lot of recent portrayals of Darth Vader. Like I'm thinking of Rogue One, where like, since the prequels, like Jedi tend to be very acrobatic and like they're powerful, but they tend to use like all these like different techniques and stuff. And a lot of times when Darth Vader shows up, like he's just like a tank.
Yeah.
And so I think they captured some of that in this fight as well, where like I think he blocks something with it, like his glove, or Seer like pulls the archives down on him, and he just kind of like steps out of it, like just like kind of the raw power angle of like the way he fights.
He's just like an unstoppable force, and that's true in a lot of the portrayals of him. Like I, for some reason, recently read a run of the Darth Vader comics that take place right after Episode 3, when he's like getting started as a Jedi hunter, and like every time he gets into a fight with a Jedi, they like basically beat him, and then he's like, actually, no, I'm not done yet, and then ends up getting the win, like almost exactly the same way. So it was kind of funny.
Yeah. I will say I found that fight annoying for one primary reason of there are like cutscenes that happen during the fight.
Yeah.
And they happen because I had to try that fight a number of times because it's a pretty hard fight. It's one of the hardest fights in the game, I would say. And every time I had to like, you'd get the cutscene again and I'd have to skip it, and like it untargets you from Vader, and like what he does, he like, I forget exactly what it is, but he has some attack or action that he does like right out of the cutscene, and it's harder to like re-get your bearings. So I would like get into a good flow, like get him down, and then the cutscene would come, and then it'd pop out of that like right back in it, and it would throw me off it threw me out of my groove every single time, and it was very annoying.
No, that was a really hard fight, and those cutscenes did not make it easier.
I feel like I would have enjoyed the fight. Oh, sorry, Ryan?
Oh, I had to try it at least twice, and I hit the same thing. I think I made it pretty far the first time, like more than halfway or something, through like 2 cutscenes, and then I had to redo it, and I was like, do I have to start from the beginning? Am I going to have to watch the cutscenes again?
Yes, you do. Yeah. The other thing about that sequence is I thought even before the Vader fight, like the visuals of like there's a moment where you're like kind of on some kind of cliffside in Jeddah, and like you see the Star Destroyers, and like all of that imagery worked very well of like the Empire coming to do what the Empire does, and burn everything to the ground, and like it was I thought even that part leading up was pretty well done.
Yeah, and I like that we got that section of the Empire bringing its might to bear, because I did feel like up to that point in the game the Empire was weirdly missing. Like there would be random stormtroopers, but it didn't feel like as much of an ever-present threat as it was to Cal in the first game. So I remember thinking a lot through the game, like, is the Empire even looking for you anymore? Like, they started out the game saying you're like one of the most wanted people in the galaxy because you've been working with Saw Gerrera and doing direct action against the Empire, but like they never show up. That's kind of weird, isn't it? And then when they finally do show up, it's really good. But
well, you did go spend 20 hours on Kobo fighting battle droids, so
yes, that's what
they don't
it was.
care if you go. They don't care if you go do that. Yeah. Then you do after that moment you do go through the ISB base, which was also another good like Empire
of something.
I'm sorry?
A good call out to another part of Star Wars, like wrapping it back into Andor a little bit there.
Yeah. Which I have to imagine they had planned that before Andor was a
I'm
thing.
sure. I mean, the ISB thing I think existed before Andor, but it was definitely highlighted in that show.
For sure, absolutely. But yeah, you got a lot of good Empire confrontations and imagery and stuff there.
Yeah, yeah. Another quick thing that I did like from that section that just made me remember is when you're kind of learning about Bode and his past in that ISB office because he's working for them, and you start to realize like, oh, there's like this kind of interfaction struggle within the Empire between the ISB and the Inquisitors.
Yeah,
like they're like terrified that Vader is going to find out that they have a Force user doing missions for them, and that he's just going to come and like kill everybody.
Having Vader as a boss would be very stressful.
Yes.
Yeah, I did also like the conversations with Cal and Bode's daughter that happened towards the end of the game, and interestingly, it's like Bode's daughter seemed fairly mature, and she seemed to like recognize that like, oh, something's going on with my dad.
Yeah.
He's maybe not making the best decisions. So I thought all that was handled well, which is tricky to do with like a child character, but I feel like they did that well.
Yeah, especially in that kind of a situation, like they sold it well for sure. And then presumably, I mean, my thought when finishing the game, I wonder if you guys felt the same way, is that the next game will feature her as a character with Cal and Marin kind of guiding her as a kid growing up in this world.
Yeah, no, that's fully my thought, is that the next game is, I don't know how many years they'll jump, if they'll jump another 5 years, but yeah, I assume some amount of time will pass. Cal and/or Marin will have trained her, I forget her name, will have trained Kata, yes. Will have trained her to some degree, and a lot of the story will kind of revolve around that relationship and Kata and where her growth is and how she fits in all of this struggle. I assume Cal is going to be back pro fighting the Empire, like not trying to hide or.
Well, yeah, I mean, presumably at this point, the Hidden Path will use Tanalorr. What's left of the Hidden Path, I guess. I don't know how much destruction that organization suffered after that attack on Jeddah, but yeah, presumably they will have Tanalorr as a base of operations for whatever they plan to do.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, like one of the last, we were talking about the dark side stuff earlier, and I think one of the last scenes in the game where they have the memorial, and Cal just kind of stands there, like. It implies that kind of he's just standing there for like a while. And I think Seer comes up and he says something to the effect of like, I'm scared or something like that. I think maybe a bit worried about what had happened. And she says, guide her, I think. What she said. And then
it's like Seer's ghost or spirit or something is like help her through the darkness or something like that.
Right. So that does seem to, I think, agree with what you two are saying about what probably will transpire.
She says guide her through the darkness. I just looked it up.
So that was a cool moment because that was like we talked about a bit after Cal goes dark side, and you have to in that fight. Like I was in that fight and I was like, sometimes the games are like they actually give you a choice, but this is not a choice. If you don't do the dark side thing, like Bode just kills you.
Yeah. I think they left some interesting threads to pick up the next game from.
Yeah, and I think I do agree with you that the back third of the game is the strongest narratively, because I think all of the back and forth with Bode and Cal and like kind of what the mirror Bode holds up to Cal, and like the things that they, I don't know. I think Bode shows Cal a lot of like the different ways his path could go.
Yeah.
And I think all of that works very well, and all the stuff we've been talking about that happens in the back third, the assault on Jeddah, and that final wrap up scene and all of that. And yeah, I will be curious to see what happens in the next game as well. Hopefully it'll be less buggy.
Yeah.
So before I think we're probably about to wrap up here. Is there any last little, nothing big, but any last little narrative thing we want to give a call out to, or make sure we at least give a mention before we give our wrap up thoughts here?
I guess the only other thing I'll mention, a bit more setting than narrative, and we touched on this, but some of the settings are super cool. Shattered Moon Base, Howling Bluffs, Singing Ruins, mountaintops on Kobo, like a lot of very cool Star Wars settings and vistas, and of course crashing ships and things like that.
Yep, and mostly new locations, not returning to a lot of Star Wars classics. Like Jeddah is an existing location from Rogue One, but yeah, most of the new stuff for not super highly used stuff. So I always appreciate that.
Yeah. Guess I'll give a shout outs to a couple characters we didn't talk about. I liked Z as a kind of goofy, semi-aloof but entertaining droid.
Yep.
In Star Wars tradition. Ravis was, I guess, kind of a generally fun, meatheady kind of boss.
Give me my warrior's death.
Yeah. I think the only other like story thing I would give, I guess, a comment on is I'm not sure I felt the chemistry with Cal and Marin.
I feel like they built pretty decent chemistry in the first game, and then just kind of like ride on that.
Yeah, I think I agree. And when I say I don't think I felt the chemistry, I mean in this game specifically.
No, I know what you meant. Yeah.
Because I thought their relationship had more to it in the first game, and maybe in a way, all of the companions maybe got more development in the first game. Like we learned a lot about like Seer's backstory in Fallen Order. We learned a lot about Marin's backstory. Like we learned a lot about their backstories in this game, and I'm not sure Survivor added a lot to their stories. Which I guess they were focusing on other characters like Bode and what they did with Centauri Kree and Dagan Gera. They were trying to flesh out those other characters, but yeah. I guess I don't really have a whole lot more to say about, don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but yeah, it was a little weird to me that, they just kind of fell right back into that and didn't really do more chemistry building, I guess. You got any last thing you want to say about narrative stuff, Nate?
I don't think so. I think we covered the big stuff.
All right. Well, we'll wrap up. Final thoughts here. Do you want to give us your final thoughts, Nate?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, overall, I probably sounded more negative on this game during this discussion than I feel. It's a lot of little gripes in a game that I overall enjoyed.
Yeah, and I think it's because if you're similar to me, I'm guessing the things you liked are kind of the things that don't need a lot of expounding on, because it's like,
I like the combat, I like the movement.
Yeah, kind of like the things that were good before are still good.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you like the story overall, even if it was a little up and down.
In the end, overall, I like the story. If it didn't have that Act 3, or that was not as good as it was for me, I would not like it.
Mm-hmm.
That seems reasonable. Of course, there's a lot of wrapping up, like the importance of Tanalorr and things like that.
And maybe the sequel will make Tanalorr make a lot more sense, because maybe it'll jump ahead like 5 years, and the crew will have spent those years like training up Kata, or like doing something, and like we'll reflect and be like, oh yeah, it was good they had that time on Tanalorr, and like I don't know, maybe it'll.
I don't think so.
Okay.
They get back to Kobo, and Grease drops the compass and it shatters into a million pieces.
I think we're looking at like a 50-50 chance that the opening sequence of the next game is Tanalorr getting blown up or something.
Darth Vader. Yeah. What about you, Ryan? What are your final thoughts here?
Guess, as I mentioned before, I think from a gameplay and mechanical perspective, like it's a game with fun elements that plays to its weaknesses a lot. More, maybe even more than its strengths. But from a story perspective, I really liked, as we've discussed, the character deliveries. I personally, it sounds like I didn't realize, there were maybe some story threads that were harder to follow. I liked sort of at least the goal and everything that they created, and the way the characters reacted to each other. But yeah, really like BD1. We haven't said much about him.
I don't think we even mentioned BD1's name.
I don't think we have, but he's great.
Yeah.
He's a very cute droid.
And yeah, I hope they make the next version without any crashes.
Yeah.
I would have to imagine, after that being a thing for both Fallen Order and Jedi Survivor, that their goal will be to make it a lot cleaner. Yeah, I guess I'm in a similar-ish boat to both of you. I think, yeah, it's a game with a lot of core things that I did really like. Like, I think at its best, the platforming and can be really fun. Like a lot of when you're wall running and dashing and grappling and like doing all these things in quick succession, it can be really exciting. And I think the combat is also still pretty strong. So I think those things have like a strong core, and I think the story has a strong core as well. Like, I think the characters are good. I think there are enough good beats in there. And I think, in a way, both the narrative and mechanical stuff kind of suffer from similar issues of like, it's just like a little too messy, a little too padded out, maybe like a little too much time, both in the exploration and in the narrative, kind of spent wandering aimlessly a little bit, especially in the first half.
Yep.
I think, yeah, I think I would have enjoyed kind of all aspects of this game a little more if it was a little tighter. I think in a way I kind of enjoyed Fallen Order more for being a tighter experience, both narratively and mechanically. So I think that's the thing I would wish for Jedi Survivor, and I think that makes it feel more disappointing, like coming from Fallen Order, that I feel was tighter, even if Jedi Survivor still does a lot of the same things, just like a lot of the core is still there. But yeah, I think it really is just that pacing and just needs a little tightening up on kind of all aspects, really. But overall, I did still like it. Just a little messy along the way.
Yep.
And I think that's gonna do it.
That's it.
Quite a lengthy and good discussion about Star Wars Jedi: Survivor. Thanks both of you for joining me for this discussion. Thanks anyone who has listened to this lengthy, spoilery podcast. And that's gonna wrap it up for our Jedi Survivor deep dive discussion here. We have been ATACS. I've been Flex, joined by Nate and Ryan, and we are signing off. See you next time.